So taking a step back from that, you're currently studying urban planning.
Yeah.
Back then, during the Robert Moses era, was there urban planning at that time? Like, I mean, they're doing things with a new technology that they couldn't have possibly foreseen, from what, like what the ramifications would be, and they're going, with this full steam ahead approach, which is probably not the best way to do it. But like, was there even a robust enough history of thinking about this type of thing that there could have been a better way at the time?
That's a really interesting question, because I think it could have multiple sort of different answers and different ways you might consider it. Personally, I think that urban planning goes way, way, way back. Even the Romans, going to ancient history, had really specific ways that they laid out cities along central axes that ran north-south and east-west, and they kind of laid cities out around a grid based on that. So it's been around for a very long time in different cultures, but there is a kind of a different way that modern planning has come up, and that's sort of what we're talking about now when we talk about this type of very kind of like highway-oriented transportation planner mindset that we're alluding to here. So early 20th century, talking about the 20s, 30s, urban planning was very, very closely associated with architecture. And it was often like architects who would be the so-called master planners, and there were often these big campus projects. Sometimes cities were completely planned out, like it's pretty famous that Jefferson laid out the plan for DC and these huge arterial boulevards that connect kind of diagonally across the city and create these sight lines around the National Mall in the center of DC.
In Manhattan, of course, the way the grid is.
Manhattan and the grid's layout. So that was done pretty early, and that was done, I'd say, toward the birth of when we consider planning. Often cited as the father of American urban planning is Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted and Fox together designed Central Park. They designed Fox was involved in Prospect Park, but Olmsted definitely.
We hit him up
we did
a few weeks ago.
like a month ago, yeah.
We had him on the podcast. You should check it out.
Right. So Olmsted, well known as a landscape architect, was also kind of sought after in his time as a city planner. And he helped lay out a lot of cities around the United States, especially a lot of smaller cities. And he worked in a time when a few different ideas around the way cities should be were starting to come up. And this involved ideas like the City Beautiful movement. This involved ideas like the Garden City movement. And a lot of these were planning brand new greenfield towns, so like towns built from the ground up, from grassy fields or woods, that were a little bit outside of these really heavily industrialized urban centers. So thinking about a city like London, where at the time, the main heating source in people's homes was still like coal-fired heating in a lot of places.
Wow.
So it was just filled with soot. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine now how totally black everything was, because there was just soot, smoke everywhere.
That's why they all wear
Yeah.
black in the photos.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, wow.
And so it was just a really dirty time. It was a
Yeah.
really dirty time to be in cities, and a lot of people were suffering from lung diseases, from all sorts of problems having to do with public health, physical health, from the way that cities were operating as these industrial, highly concentrated cores. At the time, there was this whole notion that light and air, with the contemporary theories about public health, were the cures for a lot of these ills that people were suffering from being in cities. And so the thought is we got to bring people out of cities and kind of get them into these suburbs. And this is like the beginning of when suburbs started to become a thing. Suburbs in the United States are really heavily connected with the like late 40s, 50s white flight era after World War II, and that is that coincides with this kind of mass automobile culture that the freeways helped drive as they connected people into cities. But the beginning of that suburban movement was earlier on toward the true heart of the Industrial Revolution era, and they started to bring people out of center cities more often on public transportation back then. So there were kind of streetcars, trolley lines, trains that brought people in and out of center cities into these more lush, more green garden cities and these places outside of those. And so that's Olmsted's era, and that is the era when planning and kind of, really building out and literally planning on a piece of paper the way the city was going to be started to be a more important profession. Like I said, it started with architects, but as you get toward the mid part of the 20th century, planners and the idea of city planning started to kind of diverge from the conception of architecture. And so it wasn't just architects then who had the right to design physical space, so to speak. It was planners as well who started to come up as their own profession. The first city planning departments in universities really didn't come around until that early part of the 20th century. You wouldn't have found city planning degrees or programs like that, where you would have found people studying architecture, but you wouldn't have found city planning programs until I think the 20s or the 30s in the United States.
Okay. So was Robert Moses actually trained as a planner?
Robert Moses was trained, like me, at Yale Architecture School. So,
Really? I didn't know that.
So he was a trained architect. However, as far as I know, if I'm remembering the Power Broker correctly, he never actually practiced architecture.
Oh, okay.
He came out of school, he came back to New York City, where Robert Moses was from. He was a New York native as well. And he started to look really closely at the bureaucracy of the city and the way things were run. At that time, it was under Tammany Hall. And there was a lot of corruption, needless to say, under Tammany Hall, which is now what it's synonymous with, right?
Right.
And he started working at these good government organizations that would kind of be watchdogs of the city government and say, okay, why are we spending 10 times what we thought we were going to on this courthouse? And so he started to look at, in these good government organizations, and as much as I know, Robert Moses's particular fascination was literally in the bureaucracy and how the city is choosing who to employ, where to employ them, how it's delegating the different levels of employment within the city agencies. And he wrote up, I think his dissertation, I think he went to Oxford, I think his dissertation was basically a plan recommending how New York City ought to structure its bureaucracy and how to place people where in the city government.
Oh, wow, interesting. And then he basically just took on every role of leadership in the city.
So over his tenure, he came to lead many different departments in the city and the state.
Wow.
Which is interesting it's interesting on so many different levels, but I always find the personalities within history that operate on a level that isn't traditional to be so interesting, where it's like, I know what my personal strengths are, and I also can see where the threads of power are, and I don't need to be the mayor. I just need to pull the strings that I need to pull in order to see my vision come to fruition.
It seemed like, and I guess this is actually the question I really wanted to ask what your opinion was, which I'll get to in a second, but it seems to me like he really did just pull the string really fast, kind of in a lot of different directions, and he seems like a very complicated figure to me because even just with the BQE in particular, it just kind of steamrolls right through so many different neighborhoods, and how Brooklyn Heights was able to advocate for themselves because they were wealthier. And they also got that promenade put on top, which they wanted to be private. They wanted just to be for them. And then Robert Moses was like, no, this has to be public. So he seems to be really interested in helping people and helping the public and making things better for everyone. And then at the same time seems to just do things that now with so much hindsight I can see are not great for especially disadvantaged people. So I'm curious, just since you know more about him, if you have personal opinion on how he worked.
Robert Moses is a really complicated figure and a lot of mixed reactions. You bring up Robert Moses' name and some people totally hate him. I have a more mixed opinion about Robert Moses. I think he did a lot of really terrible things in New York City, but I think he also did a lot of really important, really good things for New York City. So you mentioned him wanting to make the promenade public. We have Robert Moses to thank for, it's like some crazy amount, like 40% or something of the community parks, the pocket parks, the little parks that exist around New York City.
Wow.
Because extending from that mindset that we talked about, where access to light and air was so important, he really did believe that people ought to have space to play, that kids needed to have places to play. So part of his prerogative was to try to plan parks in every part of the city. And not just these huge parks like Pelham Bay Park, for instance, which he's associated with having created, but all these little parks that are easy to get to throughout neighborhoods. That said, he wasn't entirely benevolent. Robert Moses is pretty notoriously known for being a racist, essentially, that he did not like certain people, really looked down upon poor people in particular. And so the way that highways were taken as a tool to really run through neighborhoods, that was done strategically and with certain neighborhoods in mind. So the Federal Highway Act of the 1960s gave cities a lot of power, and really gave states a lot of power in order to control funds that were coming from the federal government to build what was seen as a utility, a new necessity. We needed to have highways that were going to be able to move lots and lots of cars, because this was the way of the future. And in doing so, the way that you could plan where highways were allowed to go through a city was connected to this idea about blight, urban blight, where poor neighborhoods, at that time typically tenement neighborhoods, most often neighborhoods that housed minorities. At that time it was almost a more expansive idea of who a minority was. You remember Italians, Irish, everybody, kind of, anybody who wasn't white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant was considered a minority at that time, but still, I mean, as were black people, as were the contemporary idea of minority peoples.
Right.
And so all of these people's neighborhoods that were in many cases thriving, sometimes they were down on their luck, poorer neighborhoods, but in many cases they were communities that were built up and had retail, business, residential, a whole mix of things. They were seen as too messy. They were seen as being not the ideal of how a city should be. And at that time, we're also talking about a time when planners wanted to control things. 1916 is when zoning came into effect in New York City in particular. New York City was a pioneer in trying to zone separate land uses to say, the city is too crazy like this. There's too much stuff going on, and in order, zoning, the idea, it comes legally from protecting this public health, moral safety, and welfare. So these are the four kind of tenets on which every zoning law is enacted.
I think only one of those is objective. I think
Right,
the three of them are
Morals.
subjective. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Health.
so
I think that's about it.
that's literally the text that's in what are called zoning enabling acts that are often written into law at the state level, which gives cities the power to create land use zoning laws. And when there's challenges against zoning, it's against those four tenets that the zoning laws are compared to say, okay, does this zoning law legitimately advance the interests of public morals or public welfare or health?
Oh my gosh.
And so this was a time when they're really trying to control cities and make them make sense logically, make them ordered, reasonable. And so these neighborhoods that were what we might see as thriving now, or what many might have seen then as thriving, were seen as disorderly and crazy places, and places breeding disease or places breeding poverty. Poverty then was also very much seen as a disease.
Right.
And they were labeled blight. And so, and this was an actual designation city planners would use at the time. They would say this area of the city is a blighted area. It has a lot of overlap with the areas that were redlined areas at the time. And so it was through these blighted areas that the city would use its really, really powerful mechanism of eminent domain to take people's properties, reimburse them some amount because it's illegal to do so without just compensation, so to speak. That compensation and the amount that was given out by the cities is highly debated.
Right.
But people's properties were taken, whole swaths of areas, like blocks and blocks and blocks, if you can imagine, were just demolished, just flattened down to the ground. And there were these huge swaths of areas, not just in New York City, but in cities around the United States that were destroyed under this program of destroying, demolishing blighted areas, and then building, honestly, highways that would run through cities, run into cities, because it was seen as such a necessity at the time.
Right. As opposed to sort of like building the highway, for example, in Red Hook, because this is right where we are, the highway runs right through and it fully disconnects. Like, you vote on the other side of the BQE, right? That's where I voted when I lived here.
And they've since changed my voting site, but yes,
they have?
the McKee Center was where we would go to vote, and
but it would
you have
take
to cross
you have to cross
thing.
this huge thing, and like I saw a possum on my way to vote one time. Like feels like you're going into a whole other world. So it's like, if for people that live over there, they're completely disconnected, as opposed to just like the water is right there too. It could just extend the highway out to where IKEA is now, instead of sort of cutting right through, and that could have all just been a neighborhood.
Although I was thinking now, with the way that the waterfront's being revitalized, I almost am glad that didn't happen, because then that wouldn't be a thing that we would have a connection to. I mean, there's no real good answer to like how this could have happened. But I mean, circling back to what I had asked earlier, I mean, it seems like there was definitely an idea of urban planning, but for lack of a term that doesn't exist that's better yet, Jesse and I have been talking about this, the idea of like masculine, feminine, or like creative, nurturing, if we're going to use some type of dichotomy here. It doesn't really seem like there was a lot of nurturing energy around. It was more like, we want to have this amazing paper design, we want to forward this great new creation that's a car, and we're not really going to reflect on who we are as creators to see what our blind spots are. We're just going to assume that all of our internal mechanisms that are making up this plan are correct, and move forward with it and put this paper thing into place. And yeah, I don't know if there was ever this, except for areas like Brooklyn Heights, which again is problematic in its own right. Yeah, we want to make this park that's private. And it's like, you know, they push back, but as far as like a reflection on what these things will mean, it seems like that we've come a long way in that respect.
We have, and I would credit planners, modern day planners, as being far more reflective on the practice of planning and what planning actually is, in terms of bringing in the voices of the communities where they're doing planning work, in terms of really thinking about their positionality of who they are, as you mentioned. At that time, that was not thought of, and it was primarily done by white, mostly straight, that was probably the one deviation that there was more of, but mostly white men. And at the time, there was very little reflection on what it meant for communities where people were planning. The other thing about it is that, there's no good place to put a highway. Just to go back to your point for 1 sec. I'm not a huge fan of highways that exist within cities. And people were not thinking,
but at the same time,
my mind is a little bit around, but
no, it's great.
So you say there wasn't really a nurturing element to planning at the time, which I would agree with, but at the same time, it was these planners were often doing city planning because they believed that their ideas were what was best for society and would result in a healthier society, or in a more civically engaged society, this, that, or the other. But it was a very paternalistic way of doing it.
Yeah, which is why I caveat the idea that like this masculine, feminine, creative, nurturing, they're incomplete terms. I haven't really found what the exact thing is, because exactly, the idea of paternal nurturing is a type, but it's this pure like, I know what is right, and we're going to make this happen based on that.